He gave her 24 hours to leave his mansion. 5 years later, the billionaire would give everything for just 1 minute with her and their daughter. Richard Kingston had built his entire life on discipline, control, and the unshakable belief that emotions were nothing more than weaknesses that destroyed men of power. As the CEO of one of the most influential corporations in the country, he had grown accustomed to issuing commands that were followed without hesitation, to closing deals where hesitation could cost billions, and to wearing a mask of icy confidence that never cracked. With dark hair perfectly styled and eyes so cold and blue that subordinates often avoided his gaze, Richard was the kind of man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke. To the outside world he was untouchable, the embodiment of success, the man who could not be swayed by anyone or anything. Yet his carefully constructed image was threatened the moment Claire Morrison, the woman who had unexpectedly slipped past his armor, confessed she was carrying his child. She had not come to him with accusations or demands but with trembling hope, believing that perhaps the love she had given him would be returned in this moment of vulnerability. Claire's dark hair framed her delicate face, her blue eyes searching his for a sign of warmth, of reassurance, of the man she thought existed beneath the exterior he showed to the rest of the world. But Richard, instead of feeling joy or tenderness, felt only the ice of panic spreading through him. A child did not fit into his plans. A child meant exposure, distraction, vulnerability. He stood before her in the great hall of his mansion, its marble floors reflecting the distance that was already growing between them. His voice, calm but cutting, filled the silence with words that would carve themselves into her memory forever. "You have 24 hours to leave this house," he said, each syllable precise and merciless. There was no room for negotiation, no softening in his tone, no trace of the affection he had once shown her. It was not anger that drove his cruelty but fear, a fear he could not admit even to himself, and so he masked it with finality. Claire felt the world collapse around her. She had known Richard could be cold, had seen glimpses of the ruthless man beneath his charm, but she had never imagined he would cast her aside so completely in the moment she needed him most. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in his presence. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why the man she loved had vanished, but instead she stood tall, gripping the strap of her bag as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Her silence was not surrender, it was defiance, though she was too broken in that moment to recognize it as such. The house, with all its opulence, suddenly felt like a gilded cage closing in on her. Every corner of it, every piece of art and every polished surface, reminded her of what she was losing, not just comfort but the illusion that she had ever been truly loved. Without another word she turned, the echo of her footsteps carrying through the empty hallways as Richard remained where he stood, rigid and unyielding. She left with only what she could carry, her heart shattered, her future uncertain, and a tiny life growing inside her that would soon become her reason to endure. When the heavy doors closed behind her, Richard exhaled for the first time since the conversation began. He told himself it was the right choice, that she had been a distraction, that sentimentality was a disease that weakened men like him. He repeated these lies until they sounded like truth, convincing himself that in 24 hours he would never think of her again. But even as he climbed the grand staircase back to his empty study, there was a flicker of unease deep inside him, a whisper he smothered quickly with arrogance. He did not know it yet, but the decision he made that night would haunt him for years, echoing louder than any business victory, overshadowing every success, until the day he came face to face with the child he had denied. Claire left the mansion that night with nothing more than a suitcase and a hollow ache in her chest that felt heavier than any burden she had ever carried. The echo of Richard's words, cold, sharp, and final, followed her into the darkness like a curse. She had no plan, no safety net, no one waiting to catch her. The city that glittered outside the windows of his world looked very different when she stepped into it alone, vulnerable, and pregnant. The first nights were the hardest. She rented a small, damp apartment in a neighborhood far removed from the luxury she had known, and as she lay on a mattress that sagged beneath her weight, she realized she would have to summon a strength she had never believed herself capable of. The months that followed were a relentless trial. She worked as many shifts as her body would allow, waiting tables in a crowded cafe where the customers barely glanced at her face. When her belly began to show, she endured the stares and the whispered judgments, but she kept her head high because she carried within her a reason to endure. Her hands ached from scrubbing dishes, her feet blistered from hours on the floor, and sometimes she went to bed hungry so she could save a few more dollars for what was to come. Yet no amount of exhaustion could overshadow the quiet moments at night when she placed her hands over her stomach and whispered to the child growing inside her, promising love, protection, and a home, even if she had to build it from nothing. When Lily was born, Claire felt both triumph and heartbreak crash over her in equal measure. The baby's dark hair curled against her tiny head, her wide blue eyes blinking curiously at the world she had just entered. She was beautiful, perfect, and yet every feature reminded Claire of Richard, of the man who had cast them aside. For one fragile moment, as she held the infant close and felt the warmth of her tiny body, Claire's heart ached with the memory of what might have been. But then Lily let out a small cry, a sound that was both fragile and demanding, and Claire's sorrow hardened into determination. This child would never feel unwanted. This child would never doubt her mother's love. Raising Lily alone proved to be even harder than Claire had imagined. Nights blurred into days as she tried to balance caring for an infant with keeping a roof over their heads. She often returned from work so exhausted she thought she might collapse, but the moment Lily stirred in her crib, Claire found the strength to go on. She learned to sew tiny clothes by hand when she couldn't afford new ones, to stretch meals so they would last the week, to turn loneliness into stories she whispered to her daughter about a brighter future. The world outside was merciless, but inside their small apartment Claire created a haven of warmth where laughter and lullabies replaced the silence of abandonment. There were moments of despair, times when the weight of everything threatened to crush her. Bills piled up, shifts were cut short, and there were nights when she cried silently into her pillow after Lily had fallen asleep. But each time, she reminded herself of the little girl who depended on her, who looked at her with eyes so full of trust it made her chest ache. That trust became Claire's anchor, her proof that she was not broken, her reminder that she was building something far more valuable than wealth or status. Over the years, Lily grew into a spirited child who filled every corner of their modest home with joy. Her laughter was a melody that erased the fatigue of the day, her questions endless and curious, her hugs fierce with affection. Each milestone, her first steps, her first words, her first drawings with crooked little hearts, was a victory Claire celebrated quietly, often with tears she didn't bother to hide. And though every feature of her daughter carried the shadow of Richard's face, Claire chose not to dwell on the man who had thrown them away. Instead, she focused on the bond she shared with Lily, a bond forged in sacrifice, resilience, and unconditional love. Yet deep within, Claire knew the past was never truly gone. There were moments, when Lily tilted her head just so or smiled with a mischief too familiar, that Claire felt the ghost of Richard hovering at the edges of her life. She forced herself to push the thought away, to remind herself that he no longer mattered, that the world they had built together, just the two of them, was stronger than the wounds he had left behind. But fate has a cruel way of bringing back what we try hardest to bury, and though she did not know it yet, the world she had constructed so carefully was about to collide with the one she thought she had escaped forever. 5 years slipped by with a strange mixture of exhaustion and quiet triumph for Claire. What began as nights of fear and struggle slowly transformed into a life built around love and resilience. Lily had grown into a lively little girl with dark hair that curled softly around her cheeks and eyes so vividly blue that they could pierce through any gloom. She was a constant reminder of Richard, but where his gaze had been cold and sharp, Lily's eyes radiated warmth, curiosity, and an innocence that made every sacrifice worth it. Their small apartment remained modest, the furniture worn and the walls in need of paint, yet within its confines laughter bloomed, and the bond between mother and daughter grew into something unshakable. Claire had found steadier work at a hotel, starting as a receptionist and eventually proving herself dependable enough to handle more responsibilities. The job did not bring wealth, but it brought stability, and that was enough. Each day she greeted guests with her polite smile, concealed her weariness behind a professional calm, and returned home to a child whose hug could erase the day's fatigue. At times, when she passed the tall windows of the lobby and caught sight of her reflection, she barely recognized herself. She was no longer the frightened young woman who had been cast out of a mansion in disgrace. She had become someone harder, steadier, a woman who had carried a burden alone and refused to break under its weight. Lily's personality began to shine in ways that startled Claire. She was quick-witted and playful, endlessly curious about the world around her. She would bombard her mother with questions at bedtime, ask why the sky was blue, why people wore suits, why some people walked with sad faces while others smiled. Sometimes she would press her tiny hands to Claire's cheeks and say, "Don't worry, Mama, I'll take care of you when I grow up." Those words melted Claire every time, even though she knew it should have been the other way around. Despite the joy, there were always shadows lingering at the edges of Claire's heart. Every so often, when Lily laughed in a way that sounded like Richard or tilted her head with that same sharpness in her gaze, Claire's chest tightened with the memory of what had been taken from them. She had trained herself to push his image away, to remind herself that he had chosen to cast them out, that he was not part of their world. But some nights, when Lily was asleep and the apartment was silent, Claire wondered whether he ever thought of them, whether he ever regretted the cold finality of his words. She hated herself for asking the question, because the answer would not change anything. Life was not easy, but it was theirs. Claire had learned how to stretch her earnings, how to repair broken toys, how to turn simple dinners into feasts when she pretended the mismatched dishes were part of a grand banquet. And Lily never knew what was missing. She didn't feel the absence of a father because Claire made sure her world was filled with love. Neighbors often commented on the girl's bright spirit and her uncanny eyes, asking whether she had family who looked the same. Claire would smile politely, but inside she felt the sting of a truth she would never share. Then came the evening when the fragile line between the past and the present began to blur. Claire was finishing her shift at the hotel, checking in a group of businessmen, when Lily ran through the lobby holding a drawing she had made, delivered to her by a kind neighbor who sometimes helped watch the child. Claire's eyes softened as she knelt to receive her daughter, but the moment froze when she noticed the tall figure entering the lobby. He was unmistakable, even after years apart. Richard Kingston stepped through the revolving doors, his dark hair as perfectly styled as she remembered, his sharp blue eyes scanning the room with the confidence of a man who still owned every space he entered. He looked untouched by time, though his face bore lines that hinted at restlessness and weariness. For a breathless moment Claire thought she was seeing a ghost, conjured by the exhaustion of too many long days. But it was not a ghost. He was real, and when his gaze fell on her, it stopped, locked, and hardened. She felt her body go rigid, her instincts screaming to shield Lily and flee, yet she was rooted in place by the shock of his presence. And then, as if the world itself conspired to betray her, Lily looked up at the tall stranger with the same blue eyes that mirrored his. Richard's face changed in an instant. The mask of control, the veneer of authority he wore like armor, cracked as recognition crashed over him. He saw himself in the little girl's face, in the color of her eyes, in the shape of her jaw. His empire, his success, his carefully built world, all of it meant nothing in the span of a heartbeat. Claire's chest constricted as she clutched Lily's hand tighter, but she knew it was too late. Richard Kingston had seen the child. He had seen the truth she had kept hidden for 5 years. And in that single moment, everything she had fought to protect was suddenly in danger of unraveling. Richard stood frozen in the lobby, his carefully maintained composure cracking in a way that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or looming scandal ever had. For years he had convinced himself that he was untouchable, that the choices he made in pursuit of control and power were final, irreversible, and justified. Yet here, in the middle of a hotel crowded with strangers, one small girl with wide blue eyes had stripped him bare with nothing more than her existence. He stared at her as though the ground beneath him had given way, the polished marble floor turning to sand, pulling him into a past he had spent half a decade trying to bury. Claire's heart pounded as she bent down, pulling Lily gently against her side, shielding her as if she could physically block the truth from reaching him. She kept her face carefully composed, but her pulse betrayed her calm, thrumming like a drumbeat of panic. She had imagined this moment countless times in her nightmares, Richard appearing without warning, discovering the child he had rejected before her birth, and demanding a place in a life where he had no right to belong. And now it was happening, and the sheer weight of his gaze told her that denial was no longer possible. He knew. Without a word, without a question, he knew. The crowd around them seemed to fade, the voices of guests, the shuffle of luggage, the clink of glasses from the bar all blending into a distant hum. Richard took a single step forward, his expression raw with disbelief, his lips parting as though words might come, but nothing left his throat. His mind raced back through years of solitude, through the hollow victories of business deals and awards, through the lonely nights in his sprawling house where silence pressed harder than any enemy. For the first time he understood what that silence had been trying to tell him. It was not power he was missing, it was her, and it was this child, their child, whose life had unfolded without him. "Don't," Claire said suddenly, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. The single word stopped him mid-step. Her eyes, once soft and pleading in the days when she had loved him without reservation, were now steel, and the sight of that strength wounded him almost as much as the child's presence. He had expected anger, perhaps even hatred, but not this calm, unyielding wall that told him he was an intruder. Lily looked up between them with innocent curiosity, her small hand clutching Claire's skirt. "Mama," she asked in a clear, ringing voice that made Richard's breath falter, "why is that man looking at us like he knows us?" Her question was innocent, but it sliced through Claire like a blade. She had spent 5 years preparing to answer every difficult question, but not this one, not now, not here. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out rough and uneven, nothing like the commanding tone the world associated with his name. "Claire." He managed, the syllables heavy with regret. His eyes flicked back to the girl, then to the woman he had once cast out, and his throat tightened until the rest of his words dissolved into silence. He wanted to say her name again, to beg for an explanation though he already knew the truth, to confess that he saw himself in the child's face so clearly it was unbearable. Claire straightened, her hand smoothing over Lily's hair, her posture radiating a protection that was both instinctive and deliberate. Her reply was quiet but firm, every word measured with the precision of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her mind for years. "She's mine, Richard. Mine alone." The weight of those words crushed him. They carried not only the reality of his absence but also the finality of a sentence that left no room for redemption. He felt as though the entire lobby had closed in on him, that every stranger could see through his perfectly tailored suit and recognize the hollowness beneath. He had thought himself untouchable, yet here he was, undone by a child's innocent gaze and the defiance of a woman who had once loved him. Claire tightened her grip on Lily's hand and turned toward the exit. Every step she took away from him cut deeper than the last, and yet he could not move, could not follow, as though invisible chains bound him to the spot. The sound of her heels against the marble echoed like a gavel striking, each click a judgment, each step a reminder of the years he had lost and could never retrieve. For the first time in his life, Richard Kingston, millionaire, titan of industry, a man who commanded empires, stood powerless, not because of a rival or a financial disaster, but because of a choice he had made 5 years ago in arrogance and fear. And as the revolving doors closed behind Claire and Lily, leaving him alone in the opulent lobby, he felt the full force of that choice crush him in a way no defeat ever had. That night Richard did not sleep. He lay in his vast, empty bedroom, staring at the ceiling while the image of the little girl's face replayed again and again in his mind. He could still see her eyes, so impossibly blue and familiar, the same eyes he saw in the mirror every morning. For 5 years he had convinced himself that his decision to drive Claire away had been necessary, that he had preserved his empire by removing what he considered a liability. He had built his life on the belief that feelings were weaknesses and that everything important could be bought, controlled, or discarded if it threatened his plans. But standing in the hotel lobby, staring into the eyes of a child who was undeniably his own. Those beliefs had shattered. He had missed her first steps, her first words, her laughter, her tears, all the pieces of a life he could never reclaim. The realization hit him with a force that nearly broke him. He had been living as half a man, pretending to be whole. He tried to bury himself in work the next day, but the numbers on the contracts blurred before his eyes. The voices of his executives droned on, and he found himself staring out the window, lost in thoughts he could not silence. For the first time in his career, his empire seemed fragile, hollow, a monument to nothing. No amount of money could buy back 5 years. No deal could erase the fact that he had chosen pride over love, arrogance over responsibility. The more he thought of Claire carrying their child alone, the more his chest tightened with guilt that made breathing painful. He remembered her eyes the night he had told her to leave, how they had pleaded for love and how he had answered with cruelty. Now those same eyes burned with strength and defiance, and he wondered if he had destroyed not only her trust but also any chance of redemption. Days passed in torment. He began appearing at the hotel more often, inventing reasons for meetings, trying to catch glimpses of Claire and the girl he now knew was his daughter. Each time he saw them, his resolve to make things right grew, though he had no idea how to begin. Finally, one evening, he found the courage to approach Claire as she left work. She walked quickly, her daughter's hand clasped tightly in hers, but Richard stepped into her path. His voice was unsteady, stripped of its usual authority. "Please, Claire," he said, the desperation in his tone undeniable. "Let me talk to you. Let me at least see her. I know I don't deserve it, but I can't pretend anymore." Claire's expression was unreadable, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. She didn't yell or lash out as he had half expected. Instead, she looked at him with a quiet calm that struck him harder than anger ever could. "You offered me money when I asked for love," she said, her voice firm but low enough that only he could hear. "You turned your back when I needed you most. I won't let you do that to her. She deserves better than a father who walked away before she was even born." The words cut deeper than any accusation because they were true. He had no defense, no excuse that could erase the past. He tried again, reaching for something, anything, that might convince her. "I was wrong," he admitted, his throat tight. "I was afraid, and I thought I was protecting myself, but all I did was lose everything that mattered. I don't expect you to forgive me, but don't shut me out of her life completely. Please, Claire." Her eyes softened only for a moment before hardening again. "You think regret changes what you did? Regret doesn't raise a child. Regret doesn't pay for sleepless nights or mend broken promises. You're too late, Richard." She turned then, pulling Lily gently away, and he stood frozen, watching them disappear into the night. When he returned to his penthouse that evening, the silence was unbearable. He walked through the endless rooms filled with expensive furniture and art, yet all of it seemed meaningless. For the first time, he admitted to himself that he would trade every piece of it for one chance to tuck his daughter into bed, for one chance to hear her call him father. But he also knew Claire was right. Regret alone was not enough. If he wanted to be part of Lily's life, if he wanted to earn even a shred of Claire's trust, he would have to prove it not with words, but with actions, and this time, there could be no arrogance, no shortcuts, and no turning back. Lying awake once more, he stared at the skyline through his window, the glittering city mocking him with its indifference. He had everything and yet nothing. And as the hours dragged on, one thought crystallized with painful clarity: he could no longer live as the man he had been. If he truly wanted to be a father, if he wanted to reclaim the love he had thrown away, he would have to dismantle the fortress of pride he had built around himself and face the consequences of his choices, no matter how much it cost. It was a week later when the fragile wall between Richard and the life he had thrown away began to crack. He had returned to the hotel almost every evening, careful to keep his distance but unable to resist the pull that drew him there. Sometimes he caught sight of Claire, always moving quickly, her posture tense, her eyes refusing to linger on him. Other times he saw the child, Lily, skipping beside her mother with her hair shining dark under the lobby lights, her little hand clutching a stuffed toy. Each time he saw her, his heart clenched with a force he could not control, and he wondered if she sensed something in him, if blood had its own silent way of calling out. The moment came unexpectedly one late afternoon when Claire was speaking with a colleague at the reception desk. Lily had grown restless and wandered a few feet away, humming a tune to herself as she played with the hem of her dress. Richard had been seated in a corner of the lobby, pretending to review documents, though he had not read a single line. His eyes lifted when the girl stopped in front of him. She tilted her head, studying him in that direct, unflinching way children do, and then she smiled faintly. "You have eyes like mine," she said simply, her voice filled with a matter-of-fact wonder that cut straight through him. Richard's breath caught in his throat. For a moment he could not move, could not even blink, as the truth of her words wrapped around him like a chain. Slowly, almost fearfully, he set aside his papers and lowered himself to her level. He had faced boardrooms full of rivals, government officials, and hostile investors, but never had he felt so exposed. "Yes," he whispered, his voice rough, "I do." He wanted to reach out, but he held his hands still, terrified of breaking the fragile thread that had formed between them. Claire's voice sliced through the air, sharp and urgent. "Lily." She crossed the lobby in seconds, her hand gripping her daughter's shoulder, pulling her back with protective force. Her eyes locked on Richard, and the warning in them was unmistakable. Yet beneath the steel there was a flicker of something else, fear, not only for her child but for herself. She had worked for years to keep this barrier unbroken, and in one innocent exchange her daughter had dismantled it. From that day forward, nothing was the same. Lily began to ask questions, her natural curiosity refusing to be stifled. Who was that man? Why does he look at me like he knows me? Why are his eyes like mine? Claire tried to deflect, tried to bury the truth under vague answers, but the questions grew bolder, and the child's persistence gnawed at her resolve. She realized that forbidding contact entirely would only feed Lily's curiosity, and so reluctantly, painfully, she allowed Richard small, supervised encounters. The first time he was permitted to sit with them in the park, Richard felt as though he had been handed a treasure too delicate for his unworthy hands. He fumbled through the simplest tasks. Reading aloud from a children's book made his voice stumble. The boys in his company had always been business partners or employees, not wide-eyed children demanding funny voices and exaggerated expressions. Playing tag in the grass left him clumsy, his polished shoes slipping, his expensive suit jacket discarded in defeat as Lily laughed and outran him with ease. And yet, for every awkward misstep, there was a smile, a laugh, a moment of trust that filled him with a joy so profound it left his chest aching. Claire watched from the edges, her arms crossed, her expression cautious. She expected him to grow frustrated, to retreat back into the arrogance that had defined him for so long. But he returned, day after day, often in simple clothes she had never seen him wear, free of the armor of wealth and power. He listened to Lily's endless stories, letting her explain the elaborate rules of games she invented on the spot, nodding solemnly as though she were delivering the most important briefing of his career. When she scraped her knee on the sidewalk, he knelt beside her with surprising gentleness, wiping away the dirt and whispering reassurances until her tears subsided. For Richard, these moments were revelations. He had imagined himself a master of control, yet here he was being taught by a child how to laugh without restraint, how to fail without shame, how to give without expecting anything in return. Each smile from Lily felt like a gift he did not deserve, each small gesture of trust a fragile step towards something he thought he had lost forever. At night, when he returned to his empty penthouse, he no longer saw it as a symbol of power but as a prison of his own making. The silence mocked him with all the years he had missed, but for the first time, there was hope burning beneath the regret. Claire, however, could not allow herself to be swept away by his transformation. She reminded herself daily of the man he had been, of the pain he had inflicted, of the coldness with which he had once dismissed her. Yet as she watched him sitting cross-legged in the grass, letting Lily braid his hair with clumsy little fingers, or saw the tenderness in his eyes when he kissed their daughter's forehead, she felt her defenses weaken. Against her will, she began to wonder if redemption was possible, if change was real, if the man she had loved so desperately years ago had been buried, waiting for the chance to return. By the time the sun set that evening and Lily fell asleep in his lap, her small hand curled around his thumb as if it had always belonged there, Claire realized with a sharp pang that the walls she had built were no longer impenetrable. She was not ready to forgive, but she could no longer deny what she saw. Richard was fighting for his place in their lives, and though she hated herself for it, she could feel that he was beginning to earn it. The weeks that followed felt like walking a tightrope for Claire, every step a balance between protecting the life she had built and allowing the man who had once shattered it to inch closer. She had sworn to herself that she would never let Richard Kingston back into her heart, yet each day he returned with the same quiet persistence, showing up not with arrogance or demands but with an unfamiliar humility that unsettled her more than his former cruelty ever had. He was not the Richard she remembered, the man who had placed power above love and cast her out without a second thought. This man stumbled through bedtime stories, listened patiently when Lily rambled about her imaginary worlds, and stood in the kitchen awkwardly trying to help with dinner even when he was clearly out of his depth. He seemed determined to prove, in 100 small ways, that he was no longer the man who had once chosen pride over family. Claire resisted at first, watching every move with suspicion, her heart still raw from the memory of how coldly he had turned her away. One evening, however, when Lily fell asleep across his lap after an exhausting day at the park, Claire walked into the living room to find him sitting completely still, as if even shifting his weight might break the spell. His hand rested gently on his daughter's back, his eyes damp as he stared down at her tiny face. There was no performance in him, no calculated gesture, only a man overwhelmed by love and regret. Claire stood silently in the doorway, her chest tightening at the sight, because it was the first time she allowed herself to admit that perhaps he truly had changed. Later that night, after Lily had been carried to her bed, Claire and Richard sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the dim light throwing long shadows across the walls. For a long time neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything left unsaid. Finally, Richard broke it. His voice was low, stripped of all authority, his hands clasped together as if he needed to hold himself steady. He confessed that the night he had told her to leave was the moment he had made the greatest mistake of his life. He admitted that he had been ruled by fear, terrified of vulnerability, of love, of the messiness that came with being human. He had convinced himself that money could solve everything, that power was enough, and in the process he had destroyed the only thing that could have given meaning to the empire he had built. His words came haltingly at first, but as he spoke, the dam of his silence broke, and years of buried regret poured out. Claire listened without interrupting, though her arms were crossed tightly in front of her as if to shield herself from the pull of his confession. His words stirred the old wounds she had tried to bury, wounds that had never truly healed. When he finished, she let the silence linger before she finally spoke, her voice steady and sharp. She told him that his absence had not only broken her heart but had forced her to carry a weight alone that should have been shared. She described the endless nights when she had held a crying baby in her arms, exhausted and terrified, with no one to lean on. She told him about the bills that nearly crushed her, the hunger she had endured so Lily wouldn't feel it, the despair that had clawed at her when she thought she couldn't go on. Her words were not accusations but truths, spoken with a quiet strength that shook him more than shouting ever could. Richard did not defend himself, did not attempt to excuse the choices he had made. He only bowed his head, letting the pain of her words wash over him like punishment he knew he deserved. When he finally raised his eyes to hers, they were raw with emotion, and he whispered that he could never undo what he had done, could never erase the scars he had left, but that he needed, the chance to be the man both she and their daughter deserved. He promised that he would not walk away again, no matter how hard it became or how much she doubted him. He begged her not for forgiveness but for the opportunity to prove himself, one day at a time. For a moment Claire wanted to dismiss him, to cling to her anger and her fear, because they had protected her for so long. But then she thought of Lily, of the way her daughter's face lit up whenever Richard entered the room, of the pure, unguarded joy in her laughter when he played with her. She could not ignore that their daughter had already opened her heart to him, and denying that bond would only hurt Lily in the end. So she looked at him across the table and told him plainly that she could not promise forgiveness, not now, perhaps not ever. She told him that if he wanted to remain in Lily's life, he would have to earn it with every action, that one misstep, one sign of the man he had been, and she would close the door forever. Richard nodded, his jaw tight but his eyes steady. He told her he understood, that he expected nothing less, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving himself worthy. For the first time since the night he had cast her out, she saw no arrogance in him, only a fragile sincerity that frightened her because it was real. That night, when she lay awake listening to the steady breathing of her daughter in the next room, Claire realized that the battle she had been fighting for years was no longer just about protecting herself. It was about deciding whether to allow the possibility of redemption, whether to let hope seep back into the cracks she had sealed so tightly. She was not ready to trust him, not yet, but as she remembered the look in his eyes when Lily had called him "Daddy" for the first time earlier that week, she knew something had shifted. The man she had thought lost forever might still exist, buried beneath regret and pride, fighting now to rise. And the terrifying part was that her heart, despite everything, still wanted to believe in him. Spring sunlight spilled softly through the curtains of Claire's apartment, filling the rooms with a warmth that felt strangely new, as if the season itself had decided to bless the fragile changes unfolding in their lives. Weeks of slow, cautious interaction had turned into a routine that none of them had expected but all three had begun to cherish. Richard now arrived not as a figure from a distant world of power and wealth but as a man stripped of titles, slipping into the role of fatherhood with awkwardness and sincerity that disarmed both Claire and Lily. He would sit on the floor with coloring books spread around him, his expensive watch forgotten as he tried to stay within the crooked lines, laughing when Lily corrected him. He took her to the park, pushing her on the swings until her squeals of delight filled the air, his hand steadying her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for the man who once lived by control and intimidation. Each day, in countless small ways, he was proving that his desire to change was real. Claire watched all of this with a heart that was both cautious and restless. She had not forgotten the night he gave her 24 hours to leave, nor the endless years of raising a child alone. That wound would always remain part of her, and she could not erase it even if she wanted to. Yet she also could not deny the man she saw before her now. There was no arrogance in his eyes when he looked at Lily, only awe and fear, the awe of having been given a second chance and the fear of losing it again. And sometimes, when their eyes met across the dinner table or during those quiet moments when Lily fell asleep between them, Claire felt the dangerous tug of the old love she had buried long ago, resurfacing in ways she could not entirely fight. The true test came one evening when Lily grew ill with a sudden fever. Claire's hands shook as she tried to cool her daughter's forehead with a damp cloth, panic clawing at her chest as memories of lonely nights with a crying baby returned with full force. But this time she was not alone. Richard stayed by her side, holding Lily in his arms with a steadiness that surprised them both, whispering soothing words while Claire prepared medicine and paced with worry. He refused to leave even for a moment, and when Lily finally drifted into uneasy sleep, her small hand still clutching his shirt, Claire looked at him and saw the truth of his transformation written in his exhaustion, in the tenderness of his gaze, in the quiet strength he offered without asking for thanks. Something inside her broke then, not in pain but in release, as though the fortress she had built around herself was finally crumbling. Later that night, when Lily was resting peacefully, Claire and Richard found themselves sitting together in the living room, the silence heavy but not hostile. He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his voice hoarse as he spoke. He told her that every day with their daughter felt like a gift he had not earned, and that the fear of losing them haunted him more than any business risk ever could. He admitted that the life he had once clung to, the empire, the wealth, the reputation, was nothing compared to the simple joy of hearing Lily's laughter or the rare moments when Claire allowed him to glimpse her smile. He said he would give up all of it, every last piece of his fortune, if it meant keeping them in his life. And for once, Claire believed him. She did not answer right away. She sat quietly, listening to the hum of the city outside, feeling the weight of years of hurt pressing against the fragile beginnings of trust. But then she reached out, slowly, uncertainly, and placed her hand over his. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement that the man she saw now was no longer the man who had once cast her aside. For Richard, that single touch meant more than any victory he had ever achieved, because it carried with it the promise of possibility. The following days unfolded with a new kind of peace. Lily no longer asked why her father looked at her strangely, because she no longer saw him as a stranger. She climbed into his lap without hesitation, tugged at his hand when she wanted to play, and fell asleep on his shoulder as if she had always known he belonged there. Claire began to notice how naturally he fit into the rhythms of their life, how his presence no longer felt like an intrusion but like something that had been missing all along. She did not tell him she had forgiven him, because forgiveness was not a single moment but a slow, fragile process. Yet in her heart she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, their story was not defined by the cruelty of the past but by the courage of what they were building now. On one quiet evening, as Lily slept peacefully in her room, Richard and Claire stood together by the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. He slipped his arm carefully around her shoulders, waiting for her to push him away, but she did not. She leaned into him, just slightly, enough to let him know she no longer carried the burden alone. For Richard, it was the culmination of everything he had longed for, not the grand displays of wealth or triumph, but the simple, quiet acceptance of the woman he had once lost and the child who had brought them back together. The man who had once given her 24 hours to leave his house now knew he would spend the rest of his life fighting to stay by her side. And as Claire stood with him in the glow of the city, her daughter safe and loved, she allowed herself to believe in something she had not dared to for years, a future that was not broken but whole, built not on power or pride, but on the love they had finally found the courage to claim.